In the last 2 hours, police violence against reporters becoming normal at Russian protests. In the last 4 hours, Russia's Putin sworn in for another 6 years in office. Putin sworn in for fourth term as Russian president. Russian police arrest 1,600 protesters during anti-Putin rallies in the last 6 hours. Current time journalist detained during Moscow inauguration protests. Cossack vigilantes to patrol Russian streets during 2018 World Cup. In the last 8 hours, Russia, Putin starts fourth presidential term amid protests. 23 journalists detained or beaten at anti-Putin rallies before. Anti-government protesters jailed and fined in St. Petersburg. Armenia's revolution and the legacy of 1988 video. Russians protest after boy is arrested at anti-Putin rally. Russian police arrest a 12-year-old for speaking at an anti-Putin rally. Putin starts new term after protests, amid tension with West. Earlier today video. Crowds of anti-Putin protesters are beaten by Cossacks. Russia's Putin sworn in as president for another 6 years. Just in. Anti-graft commissioner in trouble. Putin started his fourth term today amid mass protests and arrests. Putin 4.0 launched amid crackdown on opposition. RFE/RL protesters detained in Moscow at anti-Putin rally. Video. Pro-Kremlin Cossacks drafted to provide security at World Cup. Russians are most unhappy with Putin over wealth and equality. Poll news from Russia. What you missed over the weekend. Hundreds arrested during Russian "He's Not Miser" protests. Putin to be inaugurated for fourth term as Russian President. Vladimir Putin 4.0 to launch amid crackdown on opposition. How political crisis in Armenia could upset Russia and Turkey and Syria. Europe edition. France, Prince Louis, Iceland. Your Monday briefing. Putin prepares to be sworn in after protests. Navalny released ahead of Putin swearing in yesterday. Putin's new term set to begin with ambitious goals. Geopolitical strife. Russian opposition leader Navalny released pending charges. Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny released. Anti-Putin opposition leader Alexei Navalny out of jail following protests. Alexei Navalny released from police custody ahead of Putin's. More than 1,500 anti-Putin protesters arrested in Russia. Russian protest leader Navalny out of jail, faces 2 charges. Massive protests against Putin's inauguration held in Russia. Russian police release opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Russia's Alexei Navalny released day after mass anti-Putin protests. Alexei Navalny, Putin's sole political nemesis. Russian protest leader Alexei Navalny released after anti-Putin rally. Russia protests. Opposition leader Navalny released from police custody. Russian opposition leader Navalny released from detention. About 300 protesters detained in central Moscow. Russian protest leader Navalny released after anti-Putin rally. Thousands arrested in protest against Putin. EU and US condemn mass detention in Russia. Putin 4.0 to launch amid crackdown on opposition. Russian opposition leader Navalny says he has been released from detention. Russian opposition figure Navalny says freed from police custody. Russia's opposition leader among scores detained. Russian opposition leader at protest before detention. Russian opposition leader detained in the last 7 days, not hours. Are Russians protest against Putin's inauguration. Have Russia's anti-Putin protests gone stale? Russia opposition leader Alexei Navalny arrested amid anti-Putin protests. Anti-Putin protesters and opposition leader arrested in Russia. Russian opposition leader among hundreds arrested in anti-Putin protests. Cops detain Russia's opposition leader. Iran. Rouhani criticizes ban on Telegram messaging app. US condemns Russia's detention of thousands of anti-Putin protesters. Nearly 1,600 reported arrested in Russian anti-Putin protests. Anti-Putin leader Alexei Navalny one of 1,600 arrested.